To Data Sharks. We're really excited to have the founder and creator of BladeBridge with us. His name is Simon Eligulashvili, which is not always easy to say, but I've gotten it down. And really excited to have him. We're going to dive into what is BladeBridge, where they're taking the market, and what is it that they do. So Simon, just to give you some perspective on the channel and the Intricity 101 channel on YouTube and the audience, it's a really high variety audience. We get data architects, CIO types, as well as students. So it's a pretty broad audience. So one of the first things I like to ask folks is, if BladeBridge didn't exist, what problem would persist? What's the problem that we're solving here, that you're solving with BladeBridge, and what does that look like? So give us a little bit about that. I always like to ask founders that question because they have a unique perspective on what problems they solve.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, Jared, on this podcast. So BladeBridge, what is BladeBridge? BladeBridge is a software vendor. We provide a set of automation technologies. And those automation technologies play in the space of data warehousing, ETL, ELT, PySpark, cloud technologies. Ultimately, our toolkit allows to produce new code rapidly or convert existing code to modern technology stack. So we help companies, save money, save cost, save time, reduce risks on migrating the old technology stack that was perhaps written, starting to be written maybe 20 years ago, 10 years ago, evolved for that many years, and now it's time to migrate to new technology. If BladeBridge didn't exist, if we didn't have this tooling, that would mean for a customer spending years on modernizing their technology stack, much higher risk factors, obviously, because then the clients would be dealing with a lot of manual activities of converting code, testing code, etc. So BladeBridge really is an automation company or automation software vendor.
And I mean, how long do these, like what you mentioned, this code conversions that people do? How long do those projects take when you are doing it by hand? I guess that's kind of like asking how long a piece of string is, but like, are these year-long projects type of thing when they don't have tooling? I mean, what does it look like?
So back in the day, prior to BladeBridge, we actually did go through several code conversion projects and data warehouse implementation projects without automation technology. Even small projects would take anywhere between months to 2 years to get all the little details ironed out, making sure that the new functionality of the modernized code adheres to all the functionality that the old systems presented.
I would suspect too that if you've got an army of developers converting code from an old legacy system to something new, you probably, it's probably really hard to enforce any standards on whatever code comes out the other end. You got all this old code, you've got all these developers. It's kind of like a many-to-many relationship, and they're converting all their own way. In some ways, you might end up on the other side, maybe a little less organized than you were on, the legacy environment, just due to that fact.
That could very well be the case because obviously you are concerned with the timelines, with the costs. Conversion projects are very demanding, so very often they go out of budget, out of the timeline, anticipated timeline. Also, it's not very easy to find skilled developers, and staff your project with those at 100%. Usually there'll be project leaders, technical project leaders, and others perhaps will follow the guidelines set by the former one. But then, yes, you're bringing up a very valid point as far as how do we make sure that all the new code adheres to certain guidelines. And typically, if you don't have an conversion automation software, you have to do it post-event. You have to perhaps write another utility that will scan the code and will do, in a way, poor man's validation, just checking very superficially in some cases whether the code that was converted really adheres to the standards or not. And there'll be typically tons of things that will pop up here and there for several months, if not years. Yep.
And you'd mentioned that, so that you do code conversion, but you mentioned also like this sort of forward engineering of codes, that are creating code that didn't have a pre-existing. How are you doing that? Is there some kind of what does it look like to do that?
So that great question. That takes me back probably over a decade back. So the original software product that was developed by us was not the set of converters. It was a product called Studio. So originally BladeBridge was, there was no BladeBridge, but prior to BladeBridge, there was a company called Gamma Systems, which I started as a consultancy, and then and that was back in the 90s, actually.
Oh, wow.
That many years ago. Late 90s, yeah. And that's when we started.
Did they have computers back then? Was that a thing?
Yeah, with assembly language. No. So that's when we kind of saw data warehousing projects starting to become popular on Oracle, on Sybase, on some other technologies. And as we were doing consulting work across several, typically large financial services firms or large insurance firms in the New York area, what we noticed was that there was a lot of manual activities, a lot of error-prone manual activities, I would say, a lot of disconnected teams working on the same project. So, for example, analysts would provide their specifications in an Excel spreadsheet. Architects would provide Visio diagrams or Word documents, or even handwritten notes as far as what the design pattern should be. And then developers would have to pick up those specifications and code to them. And we saw that not on one project, not in one or two organizations, but across quite a few organizations. So for a few years, we did operate in that manual new data warehouse creation mode, where we had to work with multiple teams. And then I think the idea for the product came when perhaps I reached the peak of my frustration, where we had to explain the same thing over and over again to several teams. And that actually coincided with a version of Informatica that we were working on a project that allowed to import metadata from the outside. And it all of a sudden occurred to us that, hey, what we're explaining is really the same thing. Perhaps names of tables change or fields are changing from feed to feed, but the concept is the same. I still build my staging area the same way. I still want to have the same architectural pattern. I still want to have the same exception handling logic. So why not build a utility that will generate that metadata for multiple data feeds, hence rapidly accelerating the process of producing code, and then just import that code into Informatica and let it run. So that was actually the first version of what's now BladeBridge Studio. And that was probably in mid-2000s, maybe 2007 or so.
Okay.
And since then, we obviously built the product. It took us a few years to build the product from the scratch. And that's where really the journey started. So the original product was really forward generation utility.
So would it automatically generate all of the content for, say, Informatica and Oracle or SQL Server, that kind of thing?
Correct. Yes. So Studio is agnostic to the underlying runtime technologies. The way it works is it collects specifications agnostically for data mapping, because the data mapping process really does not have or should not have much to do with the underlying technologies, right? Whether it's whether you're running on Databricks or Informatica or Talent or Matillion, data mapping is a data mapping. It represents business logic.
Okay.
Now, the other side of the equation when you're building a warehouse or centralized data repository is how you want to design your processes that actually move the data. But that specification can be expressed in a single document, if you will. It can be expressed globally for a project because you as the architect do not want to have too many variations or any variations as far as how the code is built. So, and that's another part that Studio takes in as a specification. So Studio would not produce just vanilla code that you have to spend another several hours or days to adjust. Studio has probably over 200 or 300 architectural patterns that are extensible because we have hooks on how the code should be generated, and that's a big part because what we see is that customers get used to that benefit. They're kind of getting spoiled by the fact that there is automation and they don't have to do routine mundane activities feed to feed, and by customers I mean the development team. So go ahead.
So
please.
how did you transition then? Because you're at the very outset, you were saying, hey, I'm assuming there's a GUI, right? So there's a GUI that allows them to forward engineer code, right? How did you go from that to, okay, now we're going to be able to convert code, like old code, we're going to be able to convert it to new code? Was it just the sheer fact that you were doing a consulting engagement and it was like, hey, I know how to automate this stuff? Or like, how did you go from that?
Correct. So the creation of Studio happened, us being thrown into data warehousing world, really happened by accident. And the same with the conversion business. We started working with an ETL vendor that was about, I would say 11 years ago. That was a relative newcomer to the, to the States and to the East Coast. And at that time, we landed a project with a financial services firm that needed to build a warehouse with that particular technology. So we partnered up with that ETL vendor. We actually enhanced BladeBridge Studio or Studio product to generate code in that ETL technology. But then that same company approached us and asked us if it would be possible to repurpose some of our IP, intellectual property, to actually convert existing code as opposed from legacy ETL platforms, as opposed to building new code, generating new code. And since we had writers already for that technology and for several other technologies at that point, all we needed to do is create readers for legacy products, and that actually that concept of readers and writers is embedded into any of our converters. So and the way we develop our converters is we may develop a reader, a particular reader for a certain technology, and the writer for another technology, completely independently. But the way we package our converters is that there's an executable that pairs a particular reader with a particular writer, and between the reader and the writer, there's what we call an agnostic layer. That so the job of our readers, for example, is really to convert the metadata into an agnostic format, and the writer does not really care where that metadata is coming from. For all it cares, it can come from an external source that the customer might just put together from some proprietary ETL tool. But
and what are what are some of the technologies that you're supporting now, like in terms of being able to go to all these different places from different technologies? What are some of the technologies that you guys are dealing with?
So we deal with a really broad array of technologies, from ETL tools to SQL platforms to PySpark platforms. Just to give you an idea, Informatica, both the Power Center version, the IICS, we have readers and writers for that. Data stage, newer technologies like Matillion, we have writers for that, so we can convert code to Matillion from legacy technologies. Going to PySpark, going to many flavors of SQL platforms such as Snowflake, Redshift, Azure, Synapse, pretty much very broad range of technologies. And the way we produce new readers and writers is that internally we have, first of all, we have a methodology of producing them because we've seen so many already. Secondly, we have internally our converters are using what we call foundational classes that allow us to rapidly prototype and eventually build a full functioning product, converter product that will do either reading or writing.
Wow. I mean, it's, I have to admit, like, if you would ask me, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe even less, probably way less, like, if you would ask me if it was possible to convert automatically from one platform to another, that would, I probably have been like, well, yeah, it's probably possible, but it would be way too long. And it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of connections, a lot of different technology types. I mean, is the key to all that just super loose coupling and making sure that nothing's too tightly coupled?
That's one, absolutely. That's one of the key components or ingredients into our secret sauce. Another one is really trying to understand how, let's say, source technology functions and what are the equivalent features in the target technology, because not all technologies can be mapped cleanly. I mean, directly, perhaps. So what we do sometimes in some converters is that if, let's say, component X is not supported in the target technology, would have our converter generate a particular pattern that involves maybe three or four other components that jointly do the same thing, perform the same function as the original single component. So as an example, if we take data stages data capture component, which is a fairly complex component, although conceptually it's not, but it has a lot of features. If we were to convert that to talent does not have a direct equivalent. So the converter would generate something called a joblet that will do a two-way two-way diff process, which talent does not natively support.
Yeah, so this isn't just like, hey, search and replace this. It's
Correct.
it's
Oh, no,
there's a lot.
absolutely not. Yeah, there is a lot. And one of the recent examples of what the converter does, for example, we have a converter for data stage 2 Matillion product, and in data stage you can mix and match a lot of components that in Matillion would have to go into two different types of jobs, such as transformational job and orchestration job. So that converter, for example, automatically detects what types of components should go into pure transformation job and what type of components cannot be supported inside the transformation job. And it will generate a wrapper orchestration job that will do pre and post processing around that transformation job. And one of the things that I want to mention also, actually two more things. One is that our converters are highly configurable. So there are no two customers that want to have the same output patterns usually.
Okay.
Perhaps 90% of overlap, but there are always those little tweaks that a particular customer or particular site wants. And what we decided to do is externalize a lot of configurations that serve as hooks into our converter. So the customer ultimately is responsible or is capable of driving what the output pattern is. So that's one thing. And another thing that really quickly I want to mention is what allows us to build those converters is kind of this no fear concept. So no matter how complex the original patterns or original components are, there should always be a workaround, and that workaround most likely can be automated. So that's our drive, really.
Yeah, and I know from the Intricity side, we've seen some real gaps traversed that nobody would have thought that those two technologies could potentially be bridged to each other, but we've still been able to make it happen.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, go ahead.
Simon, you talked a little bit about Studio and sort of the genesis for where BladeBridge is, and that Studio is sort of serves as the base on which the converters get built. Is it fair to say that Studio allows you to forward engineer by setting standards, setting policies, setting sort of approaches to how you want to deal with data? And if you do things in Studio, you don't have to ever convert. Is that sort of the value proposition of Studio?
That that is exactly it. So Studio is basically a product that allows you to future-proof your organization. On day one, when you start your new project, you can define your architectural specifications, your design patterns, your output code type, ETL, ELT, a combo perhaps. But your data mappings typically will not change as you move from one technology to another, or as you want to move from one technology to another, let's say 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. So what Studio would allow a customer to do is to retain all the intelligence as far as how the sources are related to targets at the level of business terms, the data mapping really. But with switching on or off certain code generation options, you can get the Studio to generate new code. So for example, Matillion is a later technology, obviously, that came to the market later than, let's say, data stage. So if a customer were to use Studio to generate data stage code 10 years ago, and today they want to switch to Matillion and utilize the ELT approach that Matillion provides, they have two choices really, either to convert the code, the existing code, or if they use Studio originally, it would be just a matter of changing the architectural specifications within Studio without touching the data mappings, which is probably 95% of the specifications overall.
So a drop-down choice and a code regen rather than going through and doing an actual conversion.
This is interesting to me. So this is almost like decoupling. It's almost like decoupling the logic from the application.
Absolutely. So, and that was exactly the purpose of Studio. Still is. Studio serves really as an abstraction layer between your specifications and your runtime technology. So Studio is never in a runtime, and with a push of a button, you can generate the code, but you're not tied to that runtime technology. There's no lock-in.
And what are the personas? So what people, what skills? Is it only for analysts? Is it only for data architects? Is it only for data engineers? Who interacts with Studio? What sort of skills are required to use it?
Great question.
What skills would be, what personas would use it?
Great question. So formally, Studio supports the role of data analyst who will provide the data mapping specifications from source to target. So that person would provide direct mappings from field A to field B in the target, expressions or formulas.
So business logic, essentially, expressing the business logic.
Correct. And that person does not need to have a deep technical knowledge. All they need to know is how to use Excel, because the data mapping screen really resembles the Excel interface. Another persona would be data modeler, who would import the definitions of source and targets and will define, for example, natural keys or the types of dimensions that you're dealing with on the target side. The third persona would be the architect, who will define what type of code needs to be generated, what the naming conventions should be, design patterns, exception handling mechanisms, etc. And all these individual pieces comprise the entire data warehousing puzzle. And what Studio's code generator will do is it will produce a code the same way as a human developer would, except that the code will be produced consistently across hundreds or thousands of feeds, of course, without the lock-in into the underlying technology, and much more quickly, because it takes just seconds to produce the code out of specifications as opposed to manually writing the code.
So is Studio part of the runtime process then, or how does Studio, where does Studios end and where does the operations team begin?
Great question. So Studio is a design time technology, and we deliberately made it a design time technology as opposed to being a runtime. originally, back in the day, our idea was it would be probably hard to compete with runtime vendors like Informatica or DataStage or eventually Talent and the likes. And then really looking at where the problems come up when you're building warehouse or centralized repository, it's not necessarily the technologies that the teams are using. It's really methodology. It's the manual activities that are really killing the project, if you will. So we decided to make Studio a design time platform that will collect the specifications in a single metadata repository, which is queryable, and then utilize metadata-driven code generation approach as opposed to manual code production approach.
So when they need to update, it's generating the code. So like let's just say that the target platform, let's just say it's SQL for now. So it's generating SQL code. If they want to go edit that SQL code, they don't go to the SQL, they go back into BladeBridge, or they could do either. But
you could do both.
You could do both. But the benefits of going through BladeBridge Studio is not only that you'll retain your specifications, or you'll create a new version of the specification, but also you'll maintain your data lineage. You can have Studio attached to your Git repository or some other source control repositories and automatically commit the code into that repository along with the code generation. It can update the documents that Studio can update the documents that it generates. So there are quite a few benefits than just manually updating the code. Because when you manually update the code, you also have to manually probably produce documentation or update your documentation and manually commit the code into the Git, etc.
So BladeBridge is really a company that's kind of comprised of two sort of segments of the market. One is for forward engineering. The second is for converting old code to new, and you're kind of operating those two. I mean, I've noticed there's been a lot of, like some big consulting companies starting to adopt BladeBridge. And I'm curious about that uptake. Like what's the, what kinds of projects are they mostly doing? Is it mostly conversion work?
Great question, Jared. So mostly we've seen conversion work coming our way. So large companies, so we have quite a few partners now that are large companies, small boutique companies as well. But companies like Accenture or Deloitte are currently our partners. So is Infosys and some others. It's all on our website. It's mainly conversion work, and one of the things that we're noticing is, at this point we're battle tested the BladeBridge conversion technology. Really, we get requests for technologies that sometimes it's the first time we're hearing about that technology, perhaps. But the partners, the SI partners, are rather confident at this point that with our internal tooling, we can easily bridge the technological gap that.
So that brings up another question. If you've never seen the technology before, how do you know you can convert it?
I think at this point it's a gut feeling, but we normally we normally ask for sample code.
Okay.
If we see that technology is really hard to read from or write to, we normally stand up an instance of that technology in our lab and experiment with that a little bit, depending on how much time we have really to get back the answer to the client. Sometimes we need the answer today if you can convert or not.
Because that's been our experience too. Like we do have this sort of swagger that we can convert anybody when we're doing on the Intricity side, but hadn't given much thought to the fact that you guys are having to figure that out. I mean, and I know in certain cases we've provided what kind of patterns we need and stuff like that, but it is pretty amazing that it can even be done. So go ahead, Arkady, you had a question.
So talk a little bit about sort of the fact that the configuration for the converters is externalized, because I think it goes to Jared's ultimate question, which is when you're doing a complex project, the SI partner doesn't ship the code to you. They're actually the ones doing the work using the converters. So talk a little bit about why external configuration is better than sort of this this big monolithic approach to writing a converter that's very tightly coupled?
Great question, Arkady. So besides converters and the studio product, BladeBridge has a technology that's called Analyzer. So how do we know what's inside the customer code if we've never seen the code? We ask our partner sites to run this product, the Analyzer product, and what Analyzer can do is it basically gives you the insights into what the code contains. So you can run Analyzer against Informatica repository, Power Center, or IICS against date stage, talent, and many other types of technologies. And the Analyzer will give you a breakdown of things that are inside that we need to convert. For example, the list of functions, the list of components, component types, counts of each component. So we know pretty much exactly what we need to tackle. It will give you an extract of, let's say, embedded SQL statements. So we know in case the customer is going from one ETL platform and one database platform to another technology stack, we know that we need to do dual conversion at the ETL layer and SQL layer. And what we decided to do is, instead of hardwiring our conversion logic, is to provide as many hooks as possible as to how the conversion should flow. So the customer is free to say that component X in date stage converts to component Y in talent, or perhaps another way. And it could also depend on what switches in that component are enabled or disabled, because typically customers want to get the code as native to their target technology as possible, but sometimes it's not really doable because there are certain switches enabled in the source technology that would not allow for that. So, that's the type of analysis that we need to do, and all that is pretty much visible in the Excel spreadsheet. It's a multi-sheet document produced by our analyzer.
Yeah, for us, it's been an invaluable tool because we used to do an engagement. So we used to do an analysis engagement where we would spend sometimes 6 to 8 weeks trying to figure out complexities and those kinds of things. Now we do it in minutes using Analyzer. So that's been a pretty important first step to even figure out, should we do this conversion or not? Is it feasible? Can we do it within a budget that's available to us? And
it gives credibility to that budget. I mean, like when we provide numbers, it doesn't feel like we're just, throwing a guesstimate. Yeah, it's empirical. Yeah. It's very real.
Yeah.
I mean, so one of the questions I like to ask founders, Simon, is how did you know you had something special? I mean, and it could be multiple moments, like multiple events, and it usually is. But were there some events where it was like, this is going to go somewhere, like this is legit?
Well, originally that thought came to me when I started conceptualizing about Studio, and so one of the I guess traits that I saw across multiple customers is everyone's trying to build a warehouse. Everyone is trying to start building a warehouse from ground up, pretty much. But there's so many activities across many customers, many projects that are pretty much the same, just that parameters perhaps differ. And then after, I guess, I conceptualized for maybe a couple of months or so, just did, built a few prototypes. From what I recall, that was probably about 13, 14 years ago. I realized that this could be a real product that we can license out. So I remember my first deal, we pitched it together with our consulting work. Obviously, we collected tiny fee. I was still very happy.
Yeah, 0 to 1 is very good. If you can,
that's right. Yeah, that's right. But then the word started spreading out. So there were companies coming to us from vendors that we partnered up with, for which we generated technology. So we generated code for talent, and then we started seeing some customers coming through talent to us. We worked with Netezza a little bit, and then we actually ended up landing a pretty large deal with one of the major financial services firms. And the license fee that we collected from that deal was probably 100 times more higher than from our original deal. So obviously, I realized that we majorly undersold on our first deal. Luckily, it was 1 year subscription, so we went back and renegotiated next year. But yeah,
That's
funny
great.
stories. But it kind of dawned on me that it's the same problem, and and here we have a product that can help large companies save millions of dollars. And it's not necessarily that it's only large companies that are having this major issue with manual coding or manual code production. It's small companies, medium companies as well, who are probably struggling more, who need to reuse their resources across multiple functions and are really hungry for some more automation. But then we came to a conclusion that selling to small customers and landing smaller deals takes the same
amount of effort,
as the large ones. But at that time, it started kind of dawning on me that there's something special in this product. The only problem was that you have to sell it to a certain type of persona. It's perhaps not, it's not for everyone, I would say.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about Studio. Sorry, go ahead.
The problem is universal, but people that understand it sometimes, maybe different personas understand it from different perspectives. You mentioned data warehousing. So is Studio just for data warehousing, or can Studio be used for other types of projects as well?
Great question. So originally, the intent of Studio was purely for data warehousing, but then we figured that it doesn't have to be, because the same problem can be solved for creating a consolidated data repository that has nothing to do with data warehousing, just collecting data. Some of our customers are actually data vendors, and what they need to do is establish common processes for collecting customer information. So there's reusability of data mappings across multiple customers, and
so they literally sell data.
Exactly.
So I can see that. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So they're using Studio on the data ingest step. They're using it to sort of onboard data. We are using it for building not just warehouses, we're also building data lakes with it, and we're building data mesh projects, or what people are calling data mesh projects as well. We found that quite useful within Studio.
Yep, absolutely.
So one of the other questions I like to ask folks is, like, what were as you grow, there's sort of turning points, there's changes in strategy, how you go to market, all those kinds of things. It's constantly evolving as companies grow. And I was just curious, what were some of those turning points as you're kind of maturing? What were some of the turning points for you?
Well, so some of them were obviously closing large deals. It's kind of validating and revalidating that Studio is very relevant, no matter whether it was 10 years ago or now or in 10 years. We're solving the same problem regardless, and the problem is reducing manual labor and automating things, and as a result, reducing risks, costs, timelines, shortening timelines, etc. Another turning point was when we were asked to start building converters. Personally, I did not take that too seriously in the beginning, which was probably 5, 6, 7 years ago. And the reason was probably I was too focused on the Studio product, because that was the original baby. And conversion projects did not seem that sexy, as opposed to building something new, of course, right? But then I must say that building converters is much harder than building code generation modules that are starting from scratch, as opposed to taking on
20 years of code.
20 years of code, really broad varieties of patterns, some really simple and some really crazy patterns, and converting them into something that can be used today with the modern technology set.
I think this is important to clarify. So we've been involved in doing conversions with BladeBridge, and one of the key differentiators and the reason why we partnered with BladeBridge is because most of the vendors out there that do code conversion, they'll have you ship their code like to the vendor that has the automation, and then it gets shipped back as like an over-the-wall event. And you guys on the BladeBridge side seem to be far more partner friendly, more focused on partner enablement and allowing the code to kind of stay within the four walls of the organization. I mean, that had to be a decision. Like, how did you come to that?
Right. It was probably one of my co-founders' idea. Originally, I thought that it may not be a bad idea to actually, maybe take some code, show how to convert, etc. But turned out that a better idea was just to build converters that are very flexible, highly configurable, have documentation on how converters work, and give it to the customer, to the partnering SI to operate them. That's a much more scalable model. And as a matter of fact, our business model kind of discourages use of our resources to do hands-on conversion work. We sell product. It's strictly a product company, and that's how we position ourselves. So there's no need for us to look at your code to have our hands on your code.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what are some of the developments that you're aiming for now? I mean, what, and people don't like to reveal the secrets, but like, are there some things that you can share with us that you're working towards, and where you're wanting to take your product?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's still quite a few enterprises that are using obviously legacy code, and there are new platforms that are emerging, daily, monthly, annually, and we want to make sure that we are able to support the new platforms. So obviously we're on the lookout for new technologies. So for example, AWS Glue is one of them. We have Matillion Converter, really cool product, by the way. So and Matillion has multiple flavors. There's Matillion for Snowflake, Matillion for Redshift. We're looking at Matillion for PySpark. And the way we build our converters is mainly it's configuration work that we need to do, not necessarily hardcore development work. And again, besides the externalized configurations, we also have our internal configurations that allow us to scale our internal development work and configuration.
The speed of that development.
Yep.
And so what are some of your thoughts on where the future of sort of code migration, code management, where do you see that whole market going?
So until everyone realizes that Studio is the way to go, obviously there'll be new technologies, and really what's driving us is the market. If there's a large vendor or even small vendor with a really cool product coming up with a new solution, with a new feature, etc., we're always on the lookout for that. If there's a demand, we're going to be there. Pretty much.
Right.
Yep.
The other thing that we talked about in terms of in prep to this conversation is the fact that there are changes going on with data quality tools. So I know that BladeBridge is working on Great Expectations and integrations with Great Expectations. You've got some things that you're working on data lineage with Datakin, and Amundsen with the open lineage work. So I think those things are also quite exciting. So it's new targets and new languages that you'll support. I think you've got support for COBOL, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. Yes. So we support generation of easy tree. So we're talking about Studio now. So and that's in line with Studio's roadmap. Initially, Studio was just a code generation tool. Then we added document generation capabilities. Then we added data lineage diagramming capabilities. Then we added source revision control integration like Git or what was it, SVN and others. Then we started venturing into the data quality space as well. So Studio not only can generate the code for data movement, but it can also generate calls into libraries or APIs such as Great Expectations and others, whatever the customer wants. Scheduling technologies. So AWS and other providers have their own scheduling technologies like Prefect and I'm forgetting the name of the AWS scheduler. Arkady, you know that, and Jared.
Yeah, I don't remember, but it's
okay, right? Yeah. It's a precursor to Prefect. Anyway,
you're talking about Airflow.
Airflow, thank you.
Yeah, Airflow, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So we can generate code for that out of Studio, but basically we're looking at the activities that any customer organization needs to go through in order to get the project up and running. And it's by far, it's not only coding, of course. It's document production, managing your source code, data lineage, and data validation, and so on. So these are the areas that we are expanding Studio in.
So if someone wants to connect to BladeBridge or find you guys, what do they need to do?
Well, so I think there's a contact page on our website. I normally don't go there, but it's bladebridge.com. We're happy to hear from everyone, whether it's feedback, whether it's a new prospect, whether it's just a conversation that somebody wants to have. Of course, we're open to conversations, to new ideas.
Awesome. Well, Simon, it's been awesome having you on. It is exciting to see what's happened to BladeBridge over the last few years, and Intricity's been a long time partner, and we've been doing a lot of work on the BladeBridge platform. So it's been impressive to see. One of the things that I still can't get over when I go into the portal that you guys have is just the number of connectors that are there, and it's got to be a Herculean effort on your end to manage all that. So kudos to you guys, and thanks again for joining us. And we'll put that one in the history books.
Excellent. Jared,
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll catch you all later.